Case 1. Jody Herring, August 7, 2015, Washington County Court, Vermont. There are moments in a community's history that arrive without warning. Moments so sudden and so devastating that they split time into a before and an after. For the small, close-knit communities of Barr and Berlin, Vermont, August 7, 2015, was exactly that kind of day. By the time the sun set on that warm summer evening, people were gone. Families were shattered. And the woman responsible was someone who had walked among her neighbors for years, a mother, a daughter, a cousin, someone people recognized at the grocery store, at the gas station, on the sidewalk outside the post office. Her name was Jody Herring, and what she did on that day would become one of the most devastating and closely examined tragedies in modern Vermont history. To understand what happened on August 7th, you have to go back further. You have to understand the world that Jody Herring was living in and the pressure that she believed had been building against her for years. Jody was a mother. That identity, that role, was the thing she held on to more tightly than anything else. Her daughter was her anchor, the center of her daily life, the reason she got up every morning. But by the summer of 2015, Jody no longer had custody of that child. The Vermont Department for Children and Families, commonly known as DCF, had intervened in the family situation, and after an investigation and legal proceedings, custody had been removed from Jody and placed elsewhere. For Jody, this was not a legal outcome she was prepared to accept quietly. In her mind, the system had not simply ruled against her. In her mind, specific people had made specific choices that had taken her daughter away from her. And in her mind, those people needed to answer for what they had done. What investigators would later reconstruct was a picture of a woman who had reached a point of internal collapse. Not the kind that looks dramatic from the outside, but the quiet, dangerous kind, where a person stops believing that there is any legitimate path forward and starts calculating something else entirely. Jody Herring had identified the people she held responsible. She had formed a plan, and on the morning of August 7, 2015, she acted on it. The morning began in Berlin, Vermont, a small town of rolling hills and scattered homes just south of Montpelier, the state capital. Jody drove to the home of family members she had come to regard as part of the force working against her. Her aunt, Regina Herring, was there. Her cousins, Rhonda Herring and Julie Falzerano, were also present. These were women who shared her bloodline, women who had grown up in the same extended family web. But in Jody's fractured reasoning, they had cooperated with child welfare officials during the investigation into her fitness as a parent. In her mind, their cooperation had contributed to the outcome she could not forgive. What happened inside and around that Berlin home was swift and irreversible. Regina Herring, Rhonda Herring, and Julie Falzerano each lost their lives that morning. 3 women, 3 members of her own family. When first responders arrived, the scene they encountered was one that veteran officers would later describe as among the most difficult they had ever processed in their careers. The Washington County region had seen serious crimes before, but the scale and the family dimension of what had occurred in that Berlin neighborhood sent shock through the entire investigative and emergency response community. But Jody Herring was not finished. Following the events in Berlin, she drove to the city of Barr, just a few miles away but a world unto itself, a working-class city with deep granite quarrying roots and a tight community identity. Her destination was the regional office of the Vermont Department for Children and Families. The office where, in Jody's mind, the machinery of her loss had been operated. She waited, and when Laura Sobel, a state social worker employed by DCF, exited the building that afternoon, Jody Herring approached her and fired. Laura Sobel did not survive. Laura Sobel was 38 years old. She was a professional who had dedicated her career to child welfare work, one of the most emotionally demanding and chronically under-resourced fields in public service. People who knew her described a woman of genuine warmth and commitment, someone who came to work every day trying to do right by Vermont's most vulnerable children. She was not a bureaucrat in an ivory tower. She was a frontline worker who drove to homes, sat across from struggling families, and tried to navigate impossible situations. She was a mother herself. And on August 7, 2015, she walked out of her office and did not make it home. The law enforcement response that followed was immediate and massive by Vermont standards. Jody Herring was located and taken into custody the same day. Investigators began the painstaking work of reconstructing the full sequence of events, the timeline, the communications, the movements, the evidence that would form the foundation of the case against her. What they assembled was a picture of premeditation, a woman who had made a choice, who had acted on it deliberately, and who had left 4 people dead across 2 locations in the same afternoon. The case proceeded through Washington County Court with the full weight of Vermont's justice system behind it. Prosecutors presented the evidence. The legal framework was applied to the facts. And ultimately, Jody Herring entered guilty pleas, 1 count of first-degree murder and 3 counts of second-degree murder. The distinction in those charges reflected the legal findings about intent and circumstance across the 4 separate incidents. But the outcome was the same. Jody Herring was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will not walk free. The Vermont court system ensured that. In the aftermath, Vermont's child welfare system faced serious and necessary scrutiny. Legislators, child welfare advocates, law enforcement officials, and community leaders gathered to examine not just what Jody Herring had done, but what the broader landscape looked like for DCF workers operating in an environment of escalating family court tensions and dwindling public resources. Laura Sobel's death became a catalyst for conversations about worker safety, caseload pressures, and the emotional toll placed on the men and women who do this work every day without recognition. Her colleagues advocated publicly in her name. Memorials were held. A community grieved. The families of Regina Herring, Rhonda Herring, and Julie Falzerano faced the particular complexity of grieving loved ones who were taken by someone they also knew and were also related to. There is no clean category for that kind of loss. It occupies a space that most grief counselors and support systems are not fully equipped to address, because it carries the weight of family history, shared memory, and the unanswerable question of why. What remains, years later, is the permanent record. For lives ended on a summer day in Washington County, Vermont. One woman made that choice. The courts held her accountable. And the names of Laura Sobel, Regina Herring, Rhonda Herring, and Julie Falzerano are not forgotten. Not by the investigators who worked their cases, not by the community that mourned them, and not by anyone who takes seriously the responsibility we all carry to protect one another. Jody Herring is serving life without the possibility of parole in the Vermont correctional system. The case remains one of the most studied and referenced examples in Vermont's modern criminal history, a sobering reminder of how quickly and how completely the impulse toward retaliation can destroy not only enemies, but family, strangers, and the irreplaceable fabric of a community. Justice was served. But justice, in cases like this one, never fully closes the wound. It simply ensures that the wound does not claim another victim. If this case moved you, if it made you think about the social workers and child welfare professionals who show up every single day in communities like yours, take a moment right now. Like this video, leave a comment below, and make sure you have subscribed to Cold Case Hour. Your support keeps this work going, and it keeps these stories, and these victims, from being forgotten. Case 2, Melissa Robitille, August 22, 2014, Caledonia County Court, Vermont. There are cases that test the limits of what we believe a parent is capable of. And then there are cases that go beyond that limit entirely. Cases that force investigators, prosecutors, judges, and ordinary people watching from the outside to confront something they genuinely did not want to believe was possible. The case of Melissa Robitille, which unfolded in Hardwick, Vermont, in the summer of 2014, is one of those cases. It sits in a category of its own, not because of its scale, and not because of its complexity, but because of the particular vulnerability of the child at its center and the particular nature of the choice that was made. Isaac Robitille was 13 years old. He had never known a day of independence in his life. He was born with severe disabilities that left him entirely reliant on the people around him for every basic need. He was blind. He had significant developmental delays. He could not advocate for himself, could not communicate distress in a way that others outside his immediate environment would recognize, and could not protect himself in any capacity whatsoever. He received his nutrition not through a mouth or a spoon, but through a feeding tube, a medical device threaded into his body that delivered sustenance directly to his system. Isaac was, in the fullest sense, dependent. His life was entirely in the hands of the adults responsible for his care. In August of 2014, those adults failed him in a way that no child should ever be failed. Melissa Robitille was Isaac's mother. She had been his primary caregiver throughout his life, a role that carried extraordinary demands. Caring for a child with Isaac's level of need is not a part-time responsibility. It is constant, exhausting, emotionally layered work that requires patience, training, adaptability, and an unwavering commitment to the child's well-being. Support systems exist for caregivers in these situations: respite programs, social services, medical support networks. But the daily reality of that caregiving role is one that many families describe as among the most challenging experiences a human being can undertake. None of that context excuses what happened on August 22, 2014, but it helps frame the setting in which the choice was made. On that evening in Hardwick, Vermont, Isaac was experiencing what his mother and her boyfriend, Walter Richters, described as a tantrum. The precise nature of that behavioral episode, what triggered it, how long it lasted, how it presented, is part of the court record. What is also part of the court record is what Melissa Robitille and Walter Richters decided to do in response. Rather than call for medical assistance, rather than reach out to any of the support systems available to them, rather than employ any of the de-escalation or care strategies that exist for situations involving nonverbal and severely disabled children, they made a different choice. They administered vodka directly into Isaac's feeding tube. Not a small amount. A quantity that, when Isaac's blood was later tested by medical examiners, registered a blood alcohol content of 0.146%, a level well beyond what would be dangerous for a full-grown adult and catastrophically toxic for a 13-year-old boy whose body had never processed alcohol and whose compromised system had no capacity to metabolize it. Isaac Robitille did not survive. When emergency personnel arrived, and later when medical examiners completed their work, the findings were unambiguous. Isaac's cause of death was alcohol poisoning. His blood alcohol content spoke for itself. The investigation that followed was handled by Vermont law enforcement with the thoroughness that the gravity of the case demanded. Prosecutors in Caledonia County reviewed the evidence, the toxicology findings, the statements, the circumstances, and built the case that would be brought before the court. Melissa Robitille was charged with involuntary manslaughter. The legal framework of that charge reflects the court's finding that while the death was caused by her actions, the specific evidentiary and legal standards for the higher charge of intentional homicide were not met in this case. Involuntary manslaughter, as defined under Vermont law, captures circumstances where a death results from reckless or criminally negligent conduct, where someone acts in a way that creates a substantial and unjustifiable risk, and someone loses their life as a result. The administration of a lethal dose of alcohol to a medically fragile, profoundly disabled child who had no ability to refuse or resist fell squarely within that framework. She was convicted and originally sentenced to 4 to 12 years in prison. In 2020, a judge amended that sentence, trimming 6 months from her minimum term. Walter Richters, who participated directly in the events of that night, pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received a sentence of 3 years under a plea agreement reached with prosecutors. The child welfare and disability advocacy communities in Vermont responded to the Robitille case with a level of collective grief that extended far beyond the borders of Caledonia County. Isaac's story illuminated a painful reality that disability rights advocates have long worked to bring into public consciousness: that children and adults with significant disabilities are, statistically, among the most vulnerable populations when it comes to abuse and neglect. They cannot always report what is done to them. They cannot always be believed when they try. And they are dependent, in a way that most people never have to be, on the goodwill and integrity of the people placed in charge of their care. Isaac deserved better. He deserved what every child deserves: safety, protection, and a parent whose commitment to his well-being was absolute. He did not get that. But what he has now, through the public record of this case and the legal accountability that followed, is a permanent acknowledgement that what was done to him was wrong, that it was criminal, and that the Vermont justice system recognized it as such. For anyone watching who works in disability services, caregiving, child protective services, or who knows a family caring for a child with complex medical needs, Isaac's case is a reminder of why oversight, support systems, and community vigilance matter. No child with a disability should ever be invisible. No caregiver should ever be so unsupported that harm becomes thinkable. And no family should lose a child the way Isaac was lost. Melissa Robitille is serving her sentence within the Vermont correctional system. The case is closed. The record stands. And Isaac Robitille's name deserves to be spoken, not as a footnote, but as the name of a boy who mattered, who was loved by people outside that home even if he was failed inside it, and whose story changed the way Vermont talks about the safety of its most vulnerable residents. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every case on this channel represents a real person whose story deserves to be told with care. Your support makes that possible. Case 3. Briana Arnold, October 4th, 2024, Chittenden County Court, Vermont. Burlington, Vermont, is a city built on community. Nestled on the eastern shore of Lake Champlain, with the Green Mountains rising behind it and the pulse of the University of Vermont running through its neighborhoods, Burlington has always carried a particular civic pride, a commitment to its residents, to its families, and to the idea that this is a place where people look out for one another. It is a city that takes care of its own, which is why what investigators uncovered in the fall of 2024 cut so deeply, not just through the law enforcement community, but through the entire fabric of a city that had believed it knew its neighbors. On October 4th, 2024, emergency personnel responded to an apartment on Main Street in Burlington. The call that came in described a medical emergency involving an infant. When first responders arrived, they found Briana Arnold, 34 years old, performing CPR on her 3-month-old daughter, Sawyer Sanchez. The scene was frantic, desperate, and terrifying in the way that all pediatric emergencies are terrifying. Small, fragile life. Adult hands trying to hold on to it. A room charged with urgency and fear. Emergency personnel took over and transported the infant immediately to a nearby hospital. Every available medical intervention was attempted. But Sawyer Sanchez, 3 months old, did not survive. The cause of death, as determined by medical examiners, was drowning. In the immediate aftermath of Sawyer's passing, the case was handed to the Chittenden Unit for Special Investigations, known in Vermont law enforcement as QC, the specialized investigative body tasked with the most sensitive and complex cases involving child fatalities and serious harm to vulnerable individuals. QC investigators are trained not just in the mechanics of evidence collection, but in the particular emotional and procedural complexity that comes with cases where the victim is a child and where the circumstances require careful, thorough, and patient reconstruction of events. The investigation that followed lasted a full year. 12 months of evidence gathering, toxicology analysis, witness interviews, and legal review. What that investigation produced was a picture that was both heartbreaking and deeply troubling. Toxicology reports revealed that at the time of the incident, Briana Arnold had multiple controlled substances in her system, including fentanyl and methadone. The presence of those substances, in the context of what had happened to Sawyer, became central to the investigative and prosecutorial framework of the case. On October 27, 2025, 1 year and 23 days after Sawyer Sanchez lost her life, an arrest warrant was signed charging Briana Arnold with involuntary manslaughter, cruelty to a child with death resulting, and drug possession. The charges reflect the legal conclusion that the circumstances of Sawyer's death involved criminal negligence, that the environment in which this 3-month-old infant was placed, and the condition of her caregiver, created a situation of preventable and catastrophic risk that a child that young had no ability to navigate or escape. What happened next added another layer to an already devastating case. Briana Arnold was not immediately located when authorities moved to execute the warrant. She had, investigators determined, evaded initial apprehension. Vermont law enforcement launched a public search effort, releasing information and appealing to community members for assistance in locating her. The search was ongoing at the time of this documentary's research, a reminder that some cases are still unfolding, that the pursuit of justice is not always immediate, and that the legal process, however thorough, sometimes has to run a longer race than anyone hopes. Sawyer Sanchez was 3 months old. She had been in this world for 12 weeks. She had not yet had the chance to know what the view from Lake Champlain looks like in the autumn, or what Burlington sounds like on a Saturday morning, or what it feels like to walk through the city's Church Street marketplace on a warm afternoon. She had barely arrived, and she was gone in the time it takes a city to turn from summer into fall. The Briana Arnold case is, at the time of this documentary, an active matter before the Chittenden County justice system. The legal process is ongoing. The outcome will be determined by the courts, and this documentary presents only the verified facts established through public records, official charges, and confirmed investigative findings. No verdict has been reached, and Briana Arnold is, under the legal system of the United States, presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. What is not presumed, and what no legal standard can erase, is the reality of Safra Sanchez. She was real. Her 3 months of life were real. And her absence is real, felt by a community that builds its identity on caring for its most vulnerable, and that had one of its most vulnerable members lost before she ever had the chance to be known. If you or someone you know has information about this case, Vermont law enforcement continues to seek the public's assistance. And if you are a parent, a neighbor, or a community member who encounters a situation where you believe a child may not be safe, please reach out. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at 1-800-422-4453. You could save a life. You could be the person who makes the call that changes everything. Please like this video, drop a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour so you never miss a case. These stories need to be told. These victims deserve to be remembered. Case 4, Jeanne Sevigny, January 2010, Chittenden County Court, Vermont. There is a category of case that arrives without a single piece of dramatic crime scene evidence. No witnesses, no surveillance footage, no immediate alarm raised. These are the cases that begin in silence. The kind of silence that settles into a home when someone simply disappears and no one, at first, asks the right questions. The case of Jeanne Sevigny and her mother, Mary Wilcox, began in exactly that kind of silence. And it remained hidden for longer than anyone in Vermont's investigative community was comfortable with once the truth finally emerged. Mary Wilcox was 78 years old in January of 2010. She had lived a full life, decades of memory, relationship, and experience accumulated in the way that only a long life can accumulate them. But the final chapter of Mary's life had become one defined not by her accumulated history, but by what she was losing. Mary had been diagnosed with severe Alzheimer's disease, one of the most demanding and disorienting conditions that a human being can face, and one of the most demanding conditions that a caregiver can be asked to manage. Alzheimer's at its advanced stages does not simply affect memory. It reshapes personality, disrupts behavior, erases recognition, and places the person living with it in a state of profound and escalating vulnerability. The people who care for individuals with advanced Alzheimer's face an experience that is, by any objective measure, extraordinarily difficult, emotionally, physically, and psychologically. Jeanne Sevigny, 56 years old at the time, was Mary's daughter. The full picture of the relationship between Jeanne and her mother, and the circumstances that had led them to this point in January of 2010, is part of the investigative and court record assembled in the years that followed. What that record reflects is that Jeanne was present with her mother, that she was aware of the severity of Mary's condition, and that she made a choice, a deliberate, irreversible choice, that ended her mother's life. Jeanne Sevigny shot Mary Wilcox, and then, rather than contact emergency services or authorities, she made another choice. She obtained a plastic container. She placed her mother's remains inside it, and she transported that container to a storage locker in Williston, Vermont, where she concealed it from the world. Mary Wilcox, who had lived 78 years on this earth, whose life had meaning and weight and connection, did not receive a funeral, a notification to family, or a moment of official acknowledgement. She was hidden, stored. Her existence was simply, quietly, removed from the visible world. Sometime later, Jeanne moved the remains again, this time to a wooded area in Charlotte, Vermont, a small town just south of Burlington on the shores of Lake Champlain. Charlotte is the kind of place that draws people for its beauty, its quiet rural character, its views of the Adirondacks across the water. It is not, by any reasonable frame of reference, a place where a person's mother should end up hidden among the trees. The investigation that ultimately unraveled Jeanne Sevigny's concealment required the kind of patient, multi-layered detective work that Vermont's law enforcement community is capable of when the circumstances demand it. How investigators came to focus on Jeanne, how they located Mary's remains, and how they built the evidentiary framework of the case is part of a legal record that wound through the Chittenden County court system over the following year. What emerged from that process was a case built not just on physical evidence, but on the reconstructed timeline of Mary's disappearance and the choices Jeanne had made in the weeks and months that followed. In June of 2011, Jeanne Sevigny appeared before the court and entered her pleas. She pleaded no contest to manslaughter, the charge reflecting the legal framework applicable to the circumstances of Mary's death. She also pleaded guilty to illegally disposing of a dead body, the charge directly addressing the months of concealment, the storage locker, and the wooded area in Charlotte where her mother was eventually found. The court sentenced Jeanne Sevigny to serve 7 to 15 years in prison. The Sevigny case sits within a broader, painful conversation that Vermont, like every state in the country, is still actively having about elder care, caregiver support, and the circumstances that can push someone to a place of catastrophic decision-making. None of that conversation diminishes what Jeanne did, or excuses the choice she made, or reduces the weight of what Mary Wilcox lost. But it is part of an honest reckoning with a reality that exists in households across the country, that the burden of caring for a parent with advanced Alzheimer's, without adequate support, without relief, without community infrastructure, can become something that breaks a person. The answer to that breaking point is never harm. The answer is intervention, earlier, deeper, better resourced intervention by the systems designed to help. Mary Wilcox deserved to live out her final days, however many or few they were, with dignity, with care, with her existence acknowledged by the world around her. She deserved a death that was recorded, mourned, and honored. She deserved, at the very minimum, to be found. And while it took longer than it should have, Vermont's investigators ultimately ensured that she was. Jeanne Sevigny served her sentence within the Vermont correctional system. The case stands as a permanent part of Chittenden County's legal record. And Mary Wilcox, whose life was taken and whose body was hidden, is not forgotten. Not by the investigators who brought her home, and not by the audience watching this documentary right now. Like, comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every victim on this channel deserves to be known. Don't let this case disappear into the background. Keep it visible. Case 5, Janette MacAusland, April 24, 2026, Norfolk County Court, Massachusetts / Bennington County Court, Vermont. The spring of 2026 brought with it one of the most devastating cases in recent New England history. A case so raw, so recent, and so fundamentally incomprehensible in its core act that the communities on both sides of the Massachusetts-Vermont border were left searching for words that simply did not exist. The case of Janette MacAusland is not one that time has had the opportunity to fully process. It is too new. The grief is too fresh. The courtroom proceedings have only just begun. But the facts, the verified, documented, court-confirmed facts, are part of the public record, and they belong in this documentary because they belong to the children at the center of them. Kai MacAusland was 7 years old. Ella MacAusland was 6. They were siblings, a year apart in age, close in the way that young siblings so often are, sharing a world that only the two of them fully inhabited. They lived with their mother, Janette MacAusland, 49 years old, in the family's home in Wellesley, Massachusetts, one of the most affluent suburban communities in the greater Boston area. From the outside, the MacAusland household occupied the kind of physical setting that conveys stability and comfort. A well-maintained home in a well-resourced community. Children in school. A life that presented itself, to neighbors and casual observers, as ordinary. But inside that household, by the spring of 2026, something was anything but ordinary. Janette MacAusland was in the middle of a divorce, and not the kind of divorce that resolves quietly and moves on. This was the kind that had become a war, fought primarily over the two people both parents claimed to love most, Kai and Ella. Custody battles have a particular capacity for destruction that is not always visible from the outside. They create a zero-sum dynamic in which every legal victory for one parent is experienced by the other as a loss. Not just a legal loss, but a personal, existential loss. They generate documents full of accusations, hearings full of arguments, and a constant, churning undercurrent of anxiety, fear, and grievance that does not stay contained within the walls of the courthouse. Investigators and family court professionals who have reviewed cases like this one consistently identify a specific and terrifying risk profile. A parent who is losing a custody battle, who feels that loss as the destruction of their identity, and who begins to reason in ways that no longer account for the children's well-being as separate from their own. Whether Janette MacAusland reached that point gradually or all at once is something that the Massachusetts court process will examine. What the record reflects is that on the night of April 24, 2026, she made a choice that ended both of her children's lives. Kai and Ella were in their beds. They were asleep, or close to it, in the home they shared with their mother. And Janette MacAusland, their mother, took their lives. In the aftermath of what she had done, Janette attempted to take her own life. She then got into a vehicle. She drove, for 3 hours, across the border from Massachusetts into Vermont, through the darkening spring countryside, until she reached Bennington, in the southwestern corner of the state. There she went to the home of her aunt. When she arrived, she was covered in blood. She had a self-inflicted wound to her neck. And she told her aunt what she had done. Her aunt made the call. Bennington police were notified. Vermont law enforcement contacted their counterparts in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and a welfare check was dispatched to the MacAusland home. When officers arrived and entered the residence, they found Kai and Ella. Neither child had survived. Janette MacAusland was taken into custody in Vermont. She was arrested as a fugitive from justice, a designation that reflects the fact that the crimes for which she was being sought had occurred in another state, and that her presence in Vermont was the result of flight from the scene of those crimes. She subsequently waived extradition, which means she agreed to be returned to Massachusetts without requiring the formal legal process that extradition normally involves. She now faces 2 counts of first-degree murder before the Norfolk County Court in Massachusetts, the most serious charge available under Massachusetts law. There is nothing that can be said about the loss of Kai and Ella MacAusland that does justice to what was taken from this world on April 24, 2026. They were children, 7 and 6. They had lives spread out in front of them, school years, friendships, first adventures, discoveries, the accumulating experience of growing up in a world full of things they had not yet encountered. All of that was taken, not by a stranger, not by a crime committed by someone unknown, but by the one person in their world who was supposed to protect them above all others. The Wellesley and broader Massachusetts community responded with the kind of collective grief that has no roadmap. Support systems were activated in the school community. Mental health resources were made available. The Bennington community, too, which had been the site of the arrest and which had its own processing to do, found itself grappling with the weight of what had passed through it. Janette MacAusland's aunt, who made the call that notified authorities, carried a burden of her own, the burden of having been the person on the other side of that confession, the person who had to decide what to do with information no one should ever have to receive. The legal process in Massachusetts will take its course. Janette MacAusland is presumed innocent under the law until a verdict is reached. The trial will examine the full record of events, the context of the custody dispute, and the evidence gathered by investigators from both states. This documentary presents only verified facts from the public record. What is not subject to legal presumption is the humanity of 2 children who deserve to live. Kai MacAusland, Ella MacAusland, 7 and 6, gone in the spring of 2026. Their names belong in the record. Their story belongs in the conversation about what happens when adults at war with each other stop seeing their children as people separate from that war. If you're going through a family crisis, a custody dispute, or a situation that feels impossible, please reach out. The National Parent Helpline is available at 1-855-427-2275. Help exists. The path through impossible situations does not have to end in tragedy. Like, comment, and hit subscribe. Cold Case Hour is committed to telling the stories that matter, with care, with respect, and with the belief that these victims deserve more than silence. Case 6. Caitlyn Sawyer, July 26, 2024, Rutland County Court, Vermont. Not every case in this documentary began with an act of violence. Not every case involved a premeditated plan or a moment of explosive anger. Some cases are the product of something slower and, in certain ways, harder to prosecute in the court of public understanding. The gradual erosion of parental responsibility under the weight of addiction, and the catastrophic consequences that erosion can bring to the smallest and most defenseless members of a household. The case of Caitlyn Sawyer, which came to light in Rutland, Vermont, on July 26, 2024, falls into that category. And while the child at its center survived, which is the single note of relief in this otherwise deeply sobering story, what happened to that 2-year-old in Rutland represents something that every community in America grappling with the ongoing substance crisis needs to understand. On the morning of July 26, 2024, first responders were dispatched to a residential address in Rutland. The call involved a toddler, a child of 2 years old, who had stopped breathing. When emergency personnel arrived, they administered Narcan, the overdose-reversing medication used in cases of opioid toxicity. The child responded. The child survived. But the picture that investigators were now looking at was one that demanded an immediate and thorough examination of the circumstances that had led to this moment. Toxicology testing confirmed what first responders had already suspected. The 2-year-old had ingested a toxic combination of cocaine and fentanyl. In a child that small, a toddler whose entire body weight is measured in dozens of pounds, whose internal systems are in a state of active development, the presence of those substances at any detectable level represents a medical crisis. The level at which they were found in this child represented something beyond a crisis. It represented a near-fatal exposure that, had emergency personnel not arrived in time, would almost certainly have claimed the toddler's life. How had a 2-year-old ingested cocaine and fentanyl? That was the question investigators needed to answer. And when they sat down with Caitlyn Sawyer, the child's mother, the answer that emerged was one that stopped the room. Sawyer told investigators that she had a habit, a regular practice, of using her smartphone screen as a surface on which to prepare and snort illegal narcotics. The phone screen, she explained, was a surface she used frequently in the course of her drug use. And on the day in question, that smartphone had been within reach of her 2-year-old child, who had been playing with the device. The residue left on that screen, the traces of cocaine and fentanyl that remained from Sawyer's drug use, had been enough, when contacted and ingested by the child, to stop that toddler's breathing. The investigation proceeded through the Rutland County court system with the seriousness that the facts demanded. Prosecutors assembled the case. The evidence was presented. And in April of 2025, Caitlyn Sawyer appeared before the court and entered a guilty plea to child cruelty, the charge that most precisely captured the legal characterization of what the evidence established. The court sentenced her to serve 2 to 5 years in prison. The Caitlyn Sawyer case is not unique in a way that should provide any comfort. Across Vermont and across the United States, Child Protective Services investigators, pediatric emergency room personnel, and family court professionals are encountering cases involving children harmed not by acts of deliberate malice, but by the environmental consequences of parental substance use. Children who find and ingest substances left within reach. Children who are placed in cars, in homes, in situations where the adult responsible for them is in no condition to be responsible. Children who arrive at emergency rooms with toxicology results that should never appear in a pediatric record. Vermont, in particular, has faced an extraordinarily painful reckoning with the intersection of substance use disorder and child welfare. The state's geographical position, its historically limited access to treatment infrastructure in rural areas, and the economic pressures that intersect with addiction have created a landscape in which this kind of case is far from isolated. That does not make what happened to this 2-year-old acceptable. It makes it urgent. It makes the conversation about early intervention, accessible treatment, and robust child protective response not just a policy discussion, but a matter of life and death for the smallest Vermonters. The child who was revived with Narcan on a July morning in Rutland is alive today. That is something worth holding on to, a reminder that early response, community awareness, and the presence of trained emergency personnel can be the difference between a tragedy and a story with a survivor in it. But survival is not the same as safety. And this child's story, whatever comes next in it, will carry the weight of what happened on July 26, 2024, in ways that may not be fully visible for years. Caitlyn Sawyer is serving her sentence within the Vermont correctional system. The court record stands. And the case stands as one of the most instructive examples of why Vermont's ongoing public health and child welfare communities refuse to separate the substance crisis from the child safety conversation, because in too many homes, they are the same conversation. If you or someone you love is struggling with substance use disorder, help is available. SAMHSA's National Helpline, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, can be reached at 1-800-662-4357. It is free, confidential, and available 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. If this case hit close to home, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These are not stories from another world. They are stories from communities just like yours. Case 7. Angela Auclair, July 11th, 2019, Chittenden County Court, Vermont. Some cases arrive in the true crime record carrying a particular complexity. Cases where the act itself is striking enough, but where the full architecture of what was planned, who planned it, and how it was executed reveals something that goes far beyond a single moment of terrible decision-making. The case of Angela Auclair, which came to its violent conclusion at the La Platte Headwaters Town Forest in Heinsberg, Vermont, on July 11, 2019, is one of those cases. It is a case of conspiracy, of planning, coordination, and deliberate execution, and it is a case that unfolded not just between strangers, but within the most intimate unit of human organization, a family. David Auclair was, by all accounts in the investigative and court record, a man living his life in the way that most of us do, working, moving through the world, connected to the people around him. He was connected, most fundamentally, to his wife Angela. And it was that connection, that proximity, that familiarity, that would ultimately be used against him. Angela Auclair, 52 years old at the time, was David's wife. And by the summer of 2019, she had made a decision that would require the cooperation of another person she was deeply connected to, her son, Corey George. The investigation would later establish that Angela and Corey had not acted impulsively. What the evidence revealed, through cell phone records, surveillance footage, and the reconstruction of communications and movements in the days and weeks leading up to July 11th, was a plan. A deliberate, coordinated plan to lure David Auclair to a specific location and ensure that he did not leave it alive. The location chosen was the parking area at the La Platte Headwaters Town Forest in Heinsberg, a conservation area in the rolling landscape of Chittenden County, the kind of quiet, natural space that Vermont is known for, and that on a summer day in 2019 would have been visited by hikers, dog walkers, and families enjoying the outdoors. David was brought to that trailhead parking lot under circumstances that the investigative record describes as a deliberate lure. He was drawn there with a purpose he did not know, by people whose real intentions he had no reason to suspect. When David Auclair arrived at that parking lot on July 11, 2019, he was ambushed. He was shot 11 times. 11 separate discharges of a firearm, each one a choice, each one a point of no return. David Auclair did not survive. The investigation that followed was handled by Vermont law enforcement with the thoroughness and persistence that a case of this complexity demanded. Cell phone records were obtained and analyzed. The digital trail of calls, texts, and location data that modern investigations increasingly rely on to reconstruct the movements and communications of everyone involved. Surveillance footage from the area was reviewed. The full picture that emerged was one that tied both Angela Auclair and Corey George to the planning and execution of what prosecutors would characterize as a premeditated homicide, a murder for which arrangements had been made in advance, participants recruited, and a location selected. The case made its way through the Chittenden County court system over the years that followed, with Angela Auclair ultimately pleading guilty to charges of compounding a felony and being an accessory before the fact to first-degree murder. Those charges, particularly the accessory before the fact designation, reflect the legal finding that Angela Auclair's role in David's death was not that of a passive bystander, but of an active participant in the planning that made it possible. In January of 2025, she was sentenced to 18 years to life in prison. The sentencing of Angela Auclair came nearly 6 years after David was taken from a trailhead parking lot in Heinsberg. 6 years. The legal process, thorough as it is, does not always move at the speed that grief demands. For the people who knew David, who mourned him, who waited for a verdict, who sat through hearings and proceedings and continuances. That 6-year span represents something that no sentence fully addresses. It represents years of absence, years of milestones that David was not present for, years of a family reconfigured around a loss that never became smaller. The Auclair case also raises a question that communities, mental health professionals, and family systems researchers have grappled with for decades. What does it take for a family relationship, in this case, the relationship between a mother and her adult son, to reach a point where one person asks the other to participate in a violent act and the other says yes? That question does not have a simple answer. What it has is an ongoing imperative for the kind of community mental health infrastructure, family support services, and domestic conflict intervention that might, in some cases, not all, but some, interrupt the trajectory before it reaches the point of no return. David Auclair deserved to walk out of that parking lot in Hinesbook. He deserved to drive home, to continue his life, to have the ordinary days that most of us take entirely for granted. He did not get that. But the Vermont justice system, through years of careful and persistent work, ensured that the people responsible for taking those ordinary days away from him have been held accountable. Angela Auclair is serving her sentence. The case is closed. The record is permanent. And David Auclair's name belongs in this documentary, not as a cautionary tale about marriage or family, but as the name of a man whose life mattered and whose loss was not allowed to go unanswered. Like, comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. We tell these stories because victims deserve to be remembered, and communities deserve to understand what justice looks like when it is pursued with determination and care. Case 8, Stacey Vaillancourt, January 24, 2019, Rutland County Court, Vermont. Trust is the foundation of every transaction between a parent and a child care provider. When a mother or father loads a small child into a car seat on a Monday morning and drives to the home of a caregiver, hands over that child, and pulls away, they are performing an act of profound trust. They are trusting that the person they have chosen, vetted, and placed their child with will apply the same standard of care and protection that they themselves would apply. They are trusting that their child will be safe. In most cases, that trust is honored. The caregiver does their job with competence and love. The child thrives, and the Monday morning handoff is just one of the 10,000 ordinary transactions that make up the infrastructure of a working family's life. But in the case of Stacey Vaillancourt in Rutland, Vermont, on January 24, 2019, that trust was broken in a way that destroyed a family and reverberated through every corner of Vermont's childcare regulatory community. Harper Rose Breyer was 6 months old. She was new to the world in the fullest sense. Every experience still fresh. Every sensation still being processed by a developing system that had only recently arrived on the outside of the womb. She had been enrolled in Stacey Vaillancourt's state-certified in-home daycare facility, and January 24, 2019, was only her third day of care. 3 days. Harper had been in Vaillancourt's facility for 72 hours of cumulative care time when the events of that final morning unfolded. Stacey Vaillancourt was not operating an unlicensed, informal arrangement out of a back bedroom. She held a state certification, the official recognition, issued by Vermont's regulatory apparatus, that she had met the established standards for operating an in-home childcare facility. Parents who placed their children with her were doing exactly what responsible parents are supposed to do. Choosing a provider who had been vetted by the state, who operated under the framework of Vermont's childcare licensing system, who was, by every official metric, someone to whom it was appropriate to entrust a child. What was happening inside that facility, however, was something that Vermont's regulatory system had not caught and had not prevented. The forensic toxicology evaluation conducted in the wake of Harper's death revealed that the infant had been administered diphenhydramine, the active sedative compound found in adult formulations of over-the-counter antihistamines, including the widely available Benadryl brand. Diphenhydramine is not approved for use in infants. It is specifically contraindicated for children under the age of 2 by the Food and Drug Administration, and for infants, it represents a serious pharmacological risk. Vaillancourt, investigators determined, had administered the substance to Harper to induce sleep, to quiet an infant who had not yet learned how to be quiet on her own, and whose natural developmental rhythms were, apparently, an inconvenience. Harper Rose Breyer was found unresponsive in the facility. She was transported to medical care, where every available intervention was applied. She did not survive. The cause of death was the overdose of diphenhydramine that had been administered to her, a substance no one at that facility had any authority, medical training, or legal permission to give to a 6-month-old infant. The investigation that followed was thorough and unsparing. Law enforcement, child welfare investigators, and the Vermont Agency of Human Services all became involved in the process of reconstructing what had happened and building the evidentiary record that would support the charges ultimately brought against Vaillancourt. The case moved through the Rutland County court system over the years that followed, reaching its conclusion in March of 2024, 5 years after Harper's death, when a jury convicted Stacey Vaillancourt of manslaughter and cruelty to a child. She was sentenced to serve 3 to 10 years in prison. The 5-year span between the event and the conviction reflects, in part, the complexity of building a toxicology-based case and presenting it to a jury in a way that meets the legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It also reflects the procedural reality of a court system working through the full weight of the evidence. For Harper's family, for the parents who had handed their 6-month-old daughter over on a January morning with the expectation that she would be handed back, those 5 years were years of grief compounded by waiting. Years of watching a legal process grind forward while the absence in their lives remained constant and total. The Vaillancourt case had immediate and lasting consequences for Vermont's childcare licensing and oversight framework. Regulators, legislators, and child advocacy groups pushed for strengthened inspection protocols, more frequent regulatory reviews of in-home facilities, and clearer consequences for violations. The conversation about what oversight actually looks like, not just on paper, but in practice, in the homes and facilities where the state's smallest children spend their days, became more urgent, more specific, and more connected to the human cost of regulatory gaps. Harper Rose Breyer was 6 months old. She was on her 3rd day of care. She deserved to be rocked to sleep, not drugged into it. She deserved a caregiver whose response to a crying infant was patience and skill, not pharmaceutical intervention. She deserved to go home to her parents that afternoon. She did not. And the Vermont justice system, after 5 years of process and patience, delivered the verdict that Harper's memory demanded. Stacey Vaillancourt is serving her sentence. The case is closed. And Harper Rose Breyer is not forgotten. Not by the Rutland community that mourned her, not by the advocates who pushed for stronger childcare protections in her name, and not by the viewers of this documentary who are carrying her story forward right now. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every case you watch on this channel represents a real person. Your engagement keeps their stories alive. Case 9, Nytosha Laforce, April 25, 2014, Chittenden County Court, Vermont. There is a particular weight that comes with cases involving the youngest children, the ones who have barely crossed the threshold from infancy into the first tentative years of toddlerhood. Children at 15 months old are in the process of discovering the world. They are learning to walk, perhaps just beginning to form their first words, developing the earliest understanding that the world beyond their immediate reach is something they can move through and explore. They are curious and small and entirely dependent on the adults who hold the frame of their world in place. When that frame fails, when the adults who are supposed to hold it steady instead become the source of danger, the outcome is one that the justice system and the community must face with full honesty and full accountability. On the morning of April 25, 2014, emergency personnel responded to a residential address on Mallett's Bay Avenue in Winooski, Vermont, a small city that sits immediately north of Burlington, connected to it by geography and community in the way that neighboring cities so often are. The report that had come in described a child who had stopped breathing. When first responders arrived, they found 15-month-old Peyton Jarrah. He was taken to the hospital. He did not survive. An autopsy was conducted to determine the cause and manner of Peyton's death. The medical findings were clear and unambiguous. Peyton Jarrah had died as the result of severe head and neck trauma. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. That ruling, homicide, not accident, not undetermined, means that the medical examiner's office, after a full and professional review of the physical evidence, concluded that Peyton's injuries were the result of an act inflicted upon him, not a fall, not a medical event, not an unexplained tragedy. The investigation that followed involved Vermont law enforcement and child welfare investigators working together to reconstruct the circumstances of Peyton's final hours and to establish who was responsible for the injuries that had ended his life. Nytosha Laforce was identified as the subject of the investigation. The case was built over the years that followed through the standard processes of evidence collection, witness interviews, and legal review that the Chittenden County court system applies to homicide investigations. A note about the documentary record. Early media reporting on the case identified Peyton Giroux as 14 months old at the time of his death. This discrepancy was later resolved through official state records and subsequent trial transcripts, which confirmed that Peyton was 15 months old. This documentary uses the verified court record figure. The legal proceedings involving Nytosha Laforce extended over 2 years, finally reaching a resolution in October of 2016, 2.5 years after Peyton's death. At that point, Laforce changed her plea in court, entering a no-contest plea to the charges of manslaughter and child cruelty. A no-contest plea, in Vermont as in most jurisdictions, means that the defendant does not admit guilt but does not contest the charges, a legal posture that carries the same practical consequence as a guilty plea for purposes of sentencing, while preserving the defendant's right not to make a formal admission. The court sentenced Nytosha Laforce to 6 to 15 years in prison, followed by 20 years of probation. The probationary component of that sentence is notable. It reflects the court's determination that this case warranted an extended period of supervised release following incarceration, ensuring that Laforce would remain under the oversight of the justice system for 2 full decades after her release from prison. Peyton Giroux was 15 months old. He had been in this world for 15 months, 65 weeks, roughly 460 days, when his life was taken. He was at the beginning of everything. The things he would have discovered, the person he would have become, the relationships he would have formed over the years ahead. All of that was foreclosed on a morning in April in Winooski. The community of Winooski, a small, remarkably diverse city with deep roots in Vermont's French-Canadian heritage and a more recent history of refugee resettlement that has made it one of the most culturally varied communities in the state, absorbed this loss in the way that small communities absorb the worst of what can happen to the people within them, imperfectly, painfully, and with a determination to not let it simply pass into silence. The Laforce case remains part of the Chittenden County court record and part of the broader conversation that Vermont's child welfare and law enforcement communities continue to have about the intersection of domestic violence, child abuse, and the legal tools available to the justice system when the most vulnerable members of a household are harmed. Peyton's case contributed to that conversation as a reminder of the cost of inaction, the importance of early intervention, and the absolute obligation of the system to respond when a child's safety is at risk. The sentence stands. The record stands. And Peyton Giroux, 15 months old, Winooski, Vermont, 2014, is not a statistic. He was a child. And he is remembered here, on this documentary, with the dignity and the weight that his short life deserves. Like and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These stories are difficult to hear, but they are more difficult to ignore. Your support keeps this channel going and these victims visible. Case 10, Jessica Hedberg, February 25, 2026, Rutland County Court, Vermont. Every case in this documentary has, in its own way, forced us to look at the space between what a child needs and what they received. Some of those cases involve acts of violence. Some involve the consequences of addiction. Some involve the kind of calculated planning that most people prefer to believe falls outside the range of what ordinary people are capable of. Case 10 is different in its immediate nature. It does not involve physical harm, at least not in the direct sense of the cases that preceded it. But it belongs in this documentary, and it belongs at this weight, because it represents something that every parent, every neighbor, every community member, and every person who has ever cared about a child needs to understand. That abandonment is not a lesser category of harm. That leaving a child alone, truly, completely, deliberately alone, in a situation where they have no capacity to protect themselves, is a choice that carries legal consequences, moral weight, and very real potential for tragedy. In the early morning hours of February 25, 2026, Vermont State Police troopers were dispatched to the Cortina Inn in Rutland Town, a community just outside the city of Rutland in central Vermont. The call had come from motel staff, who had made a discovery that stopped them cold. Two very young children, toddlers, wandering completely unattended in a hallway of the motel. Not in a room, in a hallway, alone. In the early hours of a February morning in Vermont, when the temperatures outside are the kind that remind you what northern New England winter actually means. The children were not lost. They had not wandered out of a room where a sleeping parent would wake in moments. When investigators located and reviewed the situation, they discovered that Jessica Hedberg, 34 years old, had not simply fallen asleep or stepped away briefly. She had left. She had left the property entirely. Her children, her two toddlers, had been alone in that motel room, and when they awoke and found no one there, they had done what small children do. They had opened a door and gone looking. The image of two toddlers walking an unfamiliar hallway in the early hours of a February morning in Vermont, unsupervised, unprotected, without any adult who knew where they were, is one that, once formed in the mind, does not easily leave it. Children that small do not understand danger. They do not have the cognitive framework to assess risk, to recognize that a motel hallway is not a safe space to be alone in, to know what to do if something went wrong. They are reliant, completely and entirely, on the adults who are supposed to be with them. Jessica Hedberg was supposed to be with them. She was not. Investigators located Hedberg and placed her under arrest. She was lodged at the Marble Valley Regional Correctional Facility on bail set at $750. The charges filed against her, 2 counts of child cruelty and 2 counts of domestic assault, reflect the full scope of what the investigation uncovered about the circumstances of that evening and the broader context of the children's situation in that household. The case is active and ongoing before the Rutland County court system. Jessica Hedberg has not been convicted of any charge at the time of this documentary's production. She is presumed innocent under the law until and unless a verdict is reached. This documentary presents only the verified facts established through public law enforcement records and confirmed court filings. But the facts that are established are facts that demand to be taken seriously. 2 toddlers alone in a motel hallway in the middle of a February night in Vermont. Their mother gone. The door open. The hallway long and unfamiliar and cold. And the only reason those children are safe, the only reason this is a case that ends with arrest rather than with unthinkable loss, is that a motel staff member, working the early morning shift on what was probably just another ordinary night, looked up and saw something that wasn't right, and made a call. That person, that unnamed staff member at the Cortina Inn, is one of the quiet heroes of this story. They did what communities are supposed to do for children. They paid attention, and they acted. Vermont's first responders, who arrived and ensured the children's immediate safety, are another. The system, for all its imperfections and all the cases in this documentary where it arrived too late, arrived in time for these 2 children. That matters. That is worth acknowledging. The Hedberg case will continue through the Rutland court system, and the outcome will be determined by the evidence, the law, and the judgment of the court. Whatever that outcome, the case stands as a reminder, the final reminder in this 10-case documentary, of how thin the line sometimes is between a child who is safe and a child who is not, and of how much depends on the choices that adults make in the moments when no one is watching. Vermont's children deserve to be watched over. They deserve to be protected. They deserve adults who stay, who show up, who remain, who are present even in the moments when presence is inconvenient or difficult or costly. The 10 cases in this documentary are, each in their own way, a record of what happens when that presence fails. And the 10 victims, Laura Sobel, Isaac Robitille, Safra Sanchez, Mary Wilcox, Kai MacAusland, Ella MacAusland, the 2-year-old in Rutland, David Auclair, Harper Rose Breyer, Peyton Jarrah, and the 2 toddlers of the Cortina Inn, are the reason that this documentary exists, that this channel exists, and that this community of viewers keeps showing up to listen. Justice moves at its own pace. But it moves. And every name in this documentary is proof that the Vermont justice system, imperfect, slow, and sometimes arriving years after the wound, ultimately refuses to let these stories go unanswered. This has been Cold Case Hour. If you have watched every case in this documentary, and you are still here, thank you. It takes something to sit with these stories. It takes care and attention and a willingness to face difficult truths about what people are capable of and what communities owe each other. That willingness is what makes this channel what it is. If this documentary moved you, if it educated you, if it reminded you of why child safety matters and why the pursuit of justice is never just a legal abstraction, please like this video right now. Leave a comment below, share a thought, say a name, honor a victim. And if you have not yet subscribed to Cold Case Hour, this is the moment. Hit that subscribe button and make sure you never miss a case. These stories matter. These victims matter. And as long as this channel exists, they will not be forgotten.